Before the steam engine, before the factory, before any of it. There was a man named Thomas standing in a field that had belonged to his village for longer than the village had kept records. A field where his father had grazed animals, where his grandfather had cut peat for winter fuel, where his children had gleaned grain after the harvest. Not his field exactly, nobody's field exactly. That was the point. It was common land. It belonged to the people who lived beside it, who worked it, who depended on it. That arrangement had no deed, no title, no single document you could hold in your hand. It was older than documents. It was the floor of an entire world. In England, in the second half of the 18th century, that floor was removed. Not by war, not by plague, not by drought or famine or any force that arrives without a human face behind it. By Parliament. What Parliament did had a name. Enclosure. And to understand what enclosure actually was, what it felt like from inside, you have to first understand what it took. The commons of England were not charity. They were not wasteland left over for the poor to pick through. They were a living system, centuries old, built on an idea so simple it is almost impossible to explain to someone who has never had to rely on it. That the earth produces enough for everyone who works it, and that the people who work it have a right to what it produces. A commoner in 1750 did not own land, but he had rights over it. The right to graze his cow on the common pasture, the right to gather wood from the waste ground, the right to cut peat, to fish the stream, to glean the wheat stubble after harvest. None of these rights made him wealthy. Together, they made him viable. They were a floor, a diversified, multi-generational, collectively maintained floor, beneath which a family could not fall. Then Parliament voted to remove it. Between 1750 and 1850, more than 4,000 Enclosure Acts passed through Westminster, more than a fifth of England's total land surface redistributed. Common land that had sustained entire villages for centuries was consolidated, fenced, and transferred to private ownership. The commoners received compensation, usually a small plot of inferior ground, no access to water, no access to wood, soil so poor no one had ever tried to farm it. One man, recorded by an observer of the time, described what had been done to him in a single sentence. "All I know is, I had a cow, and an act of Parliament has taken it from me." That sentence is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Not the steam engine, not James Watt, not the cotton gin or the spinning jenny or any of the inventions you were taught about in school. The cow. Because before the factories could be filled, the fields had to be emptied. Before the workers could be put to work on someone else's schedule, for someone else's wage, on someone else's land, they had to have no other choice. The factory did not attract labor, it received it. Received the men and women and children who had been processed out of the countryside by 4,000 Acts of Parliament, left with 3 acres of worthless heath and a piece of paper certifying the transaction was legal, and nowhere left to go but the city. This is the story of how that happened, not the story of what was built, the story of what was destroyed to build it. The story of the mechanism, the specific, documented, historically verifiable mechanism by which an entire civilization was remade at speed in the language of improvement and progress and the greater good by the people who stood to benefit from the remaking, at the expense of the people who had no say in it and no means to refuse. The Industrial Revolution. You think you know this story. The cow says otherwise. The cow was not the beginning. The cow was the end, the last thing standing between a man and the factory. To understand what was actually taken, you have to go back further, back to the world before any of it. Back to what an ordinary life in England felt like before the people who owned Parliament decided it needed to be reorganized. For as long as anyone in the village could remember, longer than the oldest person alive, longer than the oldest story anyone's grandmother told. The field beyond the cottages had been shared, not divided, shared. Your strips beside your neighbor's strips, the soil parceled out so that every family worked some of the good earth and some of the poor. Nobody stuck with all the clay while someone else farmed the loam. The arrangement was so old, nobody had invented it. It had simply always been there, the way the stream had always run north and the seasons had always turned. It was not charity, it was not policy, it was just the shape of the world. Beyond the arable strips, the commons. This is where the cow grazed, where families cut peat from the bog in autumn and stacked it against the wall for the cold months ahead, where women walked the old hedgerows, not for pleasure, though there was pleasure in it, but because the hedgerows were a kind of pantry that nobody had planted and everybody used. Crabapple, hazelnut, wild blackberry, elderberry that could be boiled into medicine when a child's chest rattled in February. The hedgerow didn't belong to anyone. It had grown for centuries along the paths and field edges, and it gave what it gave to whoever needed it, freely, the way things give when they haven't yet been told they have a market value. There was the stream where a man could fish after a long day and come home with something for the pot without asking anyone's permission. The stubble fields after harvest, where the poorest families walked behind the reapers and collected the grain left behind. An entitlement so ancient it appears in the Bible, in the book of Ruth, which is to say, it is older than England itself. None of this made these people wealthy. They were not wealthy. They knew hunger and bad years. They buried children with a regularity that would break a modern heart. The work was hard, and the winters were long, and a single failed harvest could tilt the whole careful balance toward catastrophe. But here is the thing that matters, the thing the history books skim past in their eagerness to get to the steam engine. They had a floor. Not a comfortable floor, not a generous floor, but a floor, a set of interlocking claims on the world around them, accumulated over centuries, maintained collectively, that meant there was a point beneath which a family could not fall as long as the commons remained. The cow gave milk even when the employer offered bad wages. The peat kept the cottage warm even when money was short. The gleaning fed the children even after a thin harvest. No single catastrophe could reach through all of it at once, because the floor was made of many things, and the many things were not all vulnerable to the same blow. These people did not think of the commons as a gift. They thought of it the way you think of the ground under your feet, as something so fundamental it would be strange to even name it. You do not walk around grateful for gravity. You simply live inside it. That failure of imagination is what it feels like to live inside something so old it has become invisible. You do not question the ground beneath your feet. You simply walk on it. And it is what made what came next so total. In Westminster, a petition arrived. It came from the largest landowner in a parish somewhere in England. There were thousands of these petitions, thousands of parishes, the same story repeating itself across 100 years like a wave moving slowly through the country. This particular landowner was a justice of the peace, a man who sat on the local bench, who dined with members of Parliament, who in some cases was himself a member of Parliament. His petition was orderly, literate, argued in the language of improvement. The common land of the parish, he wrote, was being wasted. Think about that word, wasted. The land where families had grazed their animals and gathered their fuel and built the floor of their lives for generations. Wasted. The word does something precise. It reframes an entire world of human activity as absence, as nothing, as a problem to be solved by the people with the power to solve it. Parliament voted. The commoners of the parish had no vote in Parliament. They never had. The men who voted were, overwhelmingly, men of property. men whose class would benefit directly from what was being authorized. The enclosure commissioners arrived in the village. 3 men, usually landowners themselves, appointed by the same parliamentary process that had authorized the enclosure. They walked the fields. They measured the strips. They heard claims. The commoners were permitted to speak. What the commission was not required to do was rule in their favor. The award was made. The common pasture, the bog, the gleaning rights, reorganized, consolidated, transferred. The largest landowner received the bulk. The smaller freeholders received proportional shares based on acreage they already owned. The commoners, the people who owned no land but had used the commons their entire lives, whose parents had used it, whose grandparents had used it, received compensation. A few acres of heathland at the edge of the parish, soil so thin and acid that no one had ever successfully farmed it. No access to the stream, no access to the wood. A plot so deliberately marginal that its very marginality was a message. This is what centuries of common right were worth in the judgment of the men who took them. One landowner of the era, writing about why compensation parcels were kept this way, explained it with a candor that removes every last pretense about what enclosure actually was. The poor, he wrote, should not be given land from which they could sustain themselves independently. Because if they could sustain themselves independently, they would be, his exact words, less inclined to work. Less inclined to work. There it is. The floor didn't need to be removed because it was inefficient. It needed to be removed because as long as it existed, the men who needed cheap, desperate labor could not get it. A man with a cow and a common and a right to glean is a man who can, in extremis, say no. He has that much leverage, small leverage, but real. Remove the cow, remove the common, remove the gleaning and the bog and the strips. Give him 3 acres of acid heath and a piece of paper certifying the transaction was fair. Now he has nothing. Now the word no has been taken from him as surely as the commons were. Now he walks toward the city, not because it offers him something better, but because there is nothing left behind him. Across England, across 100 years, this happened to hundreds of thousands of families. 4,000 Enclosure Acts, 6 million acres transferred upward. Village by village, commission by commission, award by award, each one individually defensible, each one conducted according to proper procedure, each one ratified by the parliament of the people who benefited from it. And the people it happened to had one sentence for all of it. All I know is, I had a cow, and an act of parliament has taken it from me. That sentence has survived 250 years because it contains something true that no amount of economic argument can dissolve. Not anger, not revolution. Just a man standing in front of what used to be his life, trying to explain what has been done to him, and finding that the only honest accounting fits in 11 words. He is not wrong about what happened. An act of parliament took his cow. The Act of Parliament was passed by men who did not know his name. It was certified as fair by commissioners who were of the same class as the man who petitioned for it. It was enforced by a legal system that had been built over centuries by and for the people who owned land. And it was described at every stage as improvement, as progress, as the natural and necessary price of a more productive nation. This is the mechanism. Not greed in the simple sense, individual villains rubbing their hands together. Something colder than that. A system in which the people who controlled the legal machinery of the country also stood to benefit from its operation and used it steadily, incrementally, over 100 years to transfer the floor from beneath the feet of those who had no access to that machinery and no means to stop it. The factory was waiting for him on the other side of this. It had been designed with considerable precision for exactly the man the enclosure had made. A man with nothing left to sell but his hours, no leverage to refuse any wage, no alternative to whatever the factory offered, because the alternative had been taken from him by Act of Parliament and called progress. And what the factory needed from him, the specific, desperate, leverage-free person the enclosure had made, was not an accident of industrialization. It was the precondition for it. Someone had decided, long before the first factory was built, exactly what kind of human being the factory would require. And that someone had spent 50 years using Parliament to manufacture him. The question is who, and why, and how a class of men acting entirely in their own interests produced something so vast it remade the entire world. There is a question nobody asking about the Industrial Revolution ever quite answers. Why England? Why the mid-18th century? Why did the most consequential economic transformation in human history begin on this one small, damp island at this particular moment, and not in China, which had superior metallurgy, or in India, which had the most sophisticated textile tradition on Earth, or anywhere else on the planet where the conditions for industrialization seemed at least as favorable? The standard answer is coal, and rivers, and genius. James Watt watching a kettle, Richard Arkwright's commercial restlessness, a particular culture of tinkering that produced, in the right place at the right time, the right sequence of inventions. This is not wrong. It misses the most important thing. Before Watt built his engine, before Arkwright built his mill, before a single factory existed anywhere in England, someone had to solve a problem that no amount of coal or genius could solve on its own. Where were the workers going to come from? Not workers in the abstract, workers of a very specific kind. Men and women with nothing left to sell but their hours. No farm to return to, no common to fall back on, no ability to say no to whatever wage was offered, because saying no meant their children went hungry that week. Workers who were, in the precise sense of the word, desperate. This kind of workforce does not exist naturally. It has to be made. In England, in the 50 years before the first factory opened, it was made. Not by accident, by Parliament. There is a man we need to meet to understand how. His name is Sir William Morton. He is a Justice of the Peace in Lincolnshire in 1770. He owns 400 acres, a manor house, a seat in Parliament, and a problem. The problem is the common. The common that runs along the eastern edge of his estate is used by 30 or 40 families from the surrounding village. They graze their animals on it. They cut peat from the bog at its edge for winter fuel. They fish the stream that crosses it. Morton has no legal claim to this common. It belongs to the people who live beside it, in the ancient arrangement that has sustained English villages for longer than anyone can remember. But Morton watches it with the particular attention of a man who understands what he is looking at. Those families, the ones with the cow, the peat rights, the gleaning, will not work his fields for the wages he wants to pay. They do not need to. They have the common. They have what Section 1 of this story called the floor. And a man with a floor can say no. He can hold out for another shilling a week. He can refuse to work Morton's harvest on Morton's terms. He is, in the precise sense that matters to a man of Morton's class, not fully available. Morton wants laborers who have no choice, not because he is cruel in any dramatic sense, because it is cheaper. Because a man who cannot refuse cannot negotiate. Because removing a man's alternatives is, in the world Morton inhabits and the Parliament he sits in, simply good estate management. He knows exactly how to remove them. He files a petition. The petition is a perfectly ordinary document, orderly, literate, argues the common is being wasted, that it could be made more productive, that enclosure would serve the greater good of the nation. The language is the language of improvement. The same language we have already heard on the lips of every enclosure commissioner who ever rode into a village with a measuring chain. Parliament receives it. Parliament passes it. Not because there was a conspiracy, not because Morton paid anyone. Because the men who vote on Morton's petition are men exactly like Morton. They own land. They sit in Parliament because only people who own land can sit in Parliament. Before 1832, less than 1 man in 10 in England can vote at all, and every one of those men must own freehold property to qualify. The Parliament that governs England is composed almost entirely of landowners. A government report published in 1873 found that nearly all of England's 100 largest landowners also held parliamentary seats. The people who own the land and the people who make the laws about land are, to a degree that is almost impossible to overstate, the same people. When Morton's petition arrives, the men who vote on it recognize his problem because they have it too, in their parishes, on their estates, with their own commons. They vote yes. The commissioners come. They award Morton the bulk of the common, give the displaced families 3 acres of acid heath as consolation, and ride home to their own estates, which have also, in dozens of other parishes, just gotten larger. By the time the enclosure wave crests, 250,000 independent landowners in England have been reduced to 32,000. The land consolidates upward. The floor disappears beneath hundreds of thousands of families. Morton gets his cheap labor. But Morton's problem is only half solved. He has made the commoners dependent. But dependent is not the same as trapped. A desperate man can still walk away. He can leave Morton's parish and look for work somewhere else. He can sit idle for a week and wait for better terms. He can, in the last resort, simply refuse and accept the consequence of refusal, which is hunger, which is terrible but survivable if he is resourceful enough. Morton needs something more than desperation. He needs people who cannot refuse, people for whom every door except his door has been closed. Parliament closes the doors. Picture a man, call him George, a laborer in his 30s, recently stripped of his common rights, who hears there is better work and better wages in a parish 2 counties over. He packs what he has. He walks 2 days north. He arrives in the new parish and finds work and asks to stay. The local overseer tells him no. He was born in his old parish. His place of settlement is his old parish. Under the laws Parliament passed, the overseer of the new parish can send him back, forcibly, if necessary, to prevent him from becoming a burden on the local poor rates. George is returned to Morton's parish, to Morton's wages, to Morton's terms. The law of settlement is not designed to help George. It is designed to keep labor where the local landowners need it, at the price they are willing to pay, unable to move toward better conditions. Now picture that George, having been returned, tries to survive by doing occasional work, odd jobs, day labor, whatever he can find, rather than accepting Morton's standing offer. One morning, a constable stops him in the road. He cannot immediately demonstrate that he is employed. He cannot prove he is useful. Under laws Parliament has maintained and strengthened for centuries, idleness itself is an offense. A man without work is a man the authorities can arrest, punish, and put to compulsory labor at whatever rate they decide. The constable is appointed by the local magistrate. The local magistrate is Morton. George works for Morton's wages, because the alternative to Morton's wages is Morton's justice. And for those who fall through even these nets, the ones too sick or too old or too broken to work, Parliament has one more instrument. It is called the workhouse. The workhouse is where you go when you have nothing and need help. And Parliament, with a precision that leaves no room for misunderstanding its purpose, designed the workhouse to be worse than the worst available employment. Worse food, worse conditions, families separated at the door, men to one wing, women to another, children to a third. Enforced labor at tasks that served no purpose except to make the experience sufficiently unpleasant that no one would choose it if any other option existed. The men who designed this system wrote down what they were doing. They called it the principle of less eligibility. The workhouse must always be less desirable, less eligible than the lowest available work. Whatever Morton offers, the workhouse must be worse. So that no matter how bad Morton's wages are, no matter how long the hours or how hard the conditions, the man standing at the factory gate looks at the workhouse on the other side of the city and takes the job. In a different document, from a different era, men setting up houses of industry to train poor children to labor from the earliest possible age wrote the purpose without flinching. Training children to constant labor, they stated, would produce the lowering of its price. Not training, not improvement, not charity. The lowering of the price of labor. Parliament said the quiet part out loud, in writing, repeatedly, across centuries. It was not hiding what it was doing. It simply did not need to. Now hold the full shape of what has been built. Morton files a petition. Parliament passes it. Because Parliament is Morton in 4,000 different parishes, all with the same problem and the same solution. The commoners lose their floor. The laws of settlement keep them from moving to find better terms. The threat of arrest keeps them from being idle. The workhouse looms at the end of every alternative, built deliberately worse than whatever the factory offers. And at the exact moment this population, desperate, landless, legally hemmed in on every side, reaches its peak in the cities, the factories appear. Arkwright opens Cromford Mill in 1771. The factory system spreads across the north. The machines are ready. The coal is burning. And flowing into the cities, driven by 4,000 Enclosure Acts and centuries of vagrancy law and the precisely engineered misery of the workhouse, is the exact kind of human being the factory was built for. Someone with nothing left to sell but their hours. Someone who cannot refuse. Someone Parliament spent 50 years manufacturing. This is why the Industrial Revolution happened in England. Not because England was uniquely clever or fortunate or blessed with genius, because England had a parliament composed entirely of the class that stood to benefit from it. A parliament that spent 50 years systematically removing every alternative available to the people who would work inside it, then built the machines to receive them. James Watt built the engine that ran on coal. Parliament built the engine that ran on people. And the cost of running that engine, paid in bodies, in years, in the smoke over Manchester, and the crooked legs of children and the lungs that filled with fiber, falls now on the people Parliament manufactured. Their names are documented. Their testimonies survive. What happened to them is the full accounting of what Morton wanted. Parliament built the engine that ran on people. Here is what that meant. In the summer of 1799, 80 children were loaded onto wagons at the St. Pancras workhouse in London. They had been assembled in the committee room a few days before, every child who was 7 years old or considered to be of that age, and examined for their health and their willingness to go. The memoir written about one of them notes, with a particular kind of horror, that they were asked whether they consented. They were 7 years old. They were orphans. They had been living in the workhouse. They said yes. They were told what was waiting for them at the end of the journey. Roast beef, plum pudding, silver watches, rides on the mill owner's horses. They would become ladies and gentlemen, the overseers told them. At the end of 5 days on the road, they would arrive at a place that would transform their lives. Many of them looked very mournful, an observer noted. They had been traveling for 4 days already, and Nottingham was still ahead of them. At a more advanced period of their lives, he wrote, a travel to the East Indies might not have been estimated as a much more important or hazardous undertaking. Robert Blincoe was among the 80. He was an orphan, no parents recorded, no surname anyone could verify. He had been left at St. Pancras at the age of 4. He was 7 when the wagons came, which means he had been in the workhouse for 3 years before anyone decided to do something with him. And what they decided to do was send him 200 miles north to work in a cotton mill. He had never seen a cotton mill. He had never heard one. Lodham Mill in Nottinghamshire was the first. 5 days of traveling, and then the machines. The noise was the first thing. Industrial noise. The kind no child raised in a London workhouse had ever encountered. The frames turning at speed, the shuttles, the steady mechanical roar of a building full of moving metal. Robert Blincoe remembered it for the rest of his life. His first job was mule scavenger. While the spinning frames ran, while the frames turned at the height of a child's head, carrying thread at speed, Robert crawled beneath them to collect the loose cotton that fell to the floor. The machines did not stop while he worked beneath them. They never stopped. The overlooker who supervised his section had been told to produce a certain quantity of work in a given time. If the children in his section did not meet that quantity, he was dismissed. If they did meet it, he received a bonus. The beating of children, the memoir notes with a precision that makes the reader's stomach drop, was therefore not cruelty for its own sake. It was the most efficient tool available for extracting the required output from small bodies that would otherwise slow down or stop. "Do your work well," the manager told Robert on his first day, "and you'll not be beaten." He lost half a finger within his first weeks. The machines did not stop for that either. The food was porridge and black bread. The dormitory was a room shared by all the apprentice children. Robert Blincoe, in his published memoir, wrote that he contemplated suicide many times during those years. He was 7 years old when he arrived. He had been told he would eat roast beef and ride horses. When Lodham Mill closed in 1802, Robert was sent to Lytton Mill in Derbyshire. Lytton Mill sits in a steep valley carved by the River Wye in the Peak District. Beautiful country, isolated country. Country where a child trying to escape had nowhere to go and no one who would help him. The mill had been set up by a man named Ellis Needham, a farmer who had sunk most of his assets into the venture and whose financial desperation made itself felt every day in how the children inside his mill were treated. Children at Lytton worked 14 hours a day. On Saturdays, they worked until midnight. Robert Blincoe later recalled that the children were constantly covered in bruises, cuts, and welts, that when they finally reached their beds at night, it was often impossible to find a position they could lie in without pain from the injuries accumulated during the day. The food was so inadequate that the children's bodies were beginning to deform from malnutrition. Some grew crooked. Some fell ill and stayed ill. Some died. Robert tried twice, as a teenager, to alert the authorities to what was happening at Lytton Mill. He found that the doctor, the magistrate's clerk, and Ellis Needham all moved in the same social world. They dined together. They knew each other. When Robert came to them with his testimony, they returned it to Needham. The only result was more brutality. This is the moment where the thesis of this entire video becomes visible in a single social arrangement. The factory owner, the law, the medicine, the authority. All the same class, all the same table, all working in the same direction. Robert Blincoe had no recourse because every institution that existed to provide recourse was operated by the class that ran the mill. Some of the boys at Lytton responded to this knowledge in the only way that made sense to them. They committed crimes deliberately: petty theft, minor offenses, anything that might result in being brought before the law, because transportation to Botany Bay, to Australia, 12,000 miles away, was a sentence they were willing to seek out. They believed, with the logic of children who had run out of other options, that a convict ship to the other side of the world would be better than another year at Lytton Mill. Ellis Needham was declared bankrupt in 1815. He died a pauper. Robert Blinko walked out of the mill system in 1813 at 21 years old, with legs permanently crooked from years of stooping beneath the frames. A man who knew him in Manchester years later described him, "a little man in height, his legs being very crooked, the result of his early life in a cotton factory." He founded a small business. He married a woman named Martha. His son won a scholarship to Cambridge. His daughter made a good marriage. He told his story to a journalist named John Brown in 1822, and Brown wrote it down. Brown gave the manuscript to a friend named Richard Carlyle before killing himself. Carlyle published it in 1828. It caused a parliamentary scandal. Parliament investigated. The mills kept running. Robert Blinko was not the exception. He was the ordinary case that happened to survive long enough to be found by a journalist. The ordinary case of a child who made it out with crooked legs and a memoir. The mills were full of ordinary cases that left no memoir because the people inside them left nothing. No testimony, no record, no name attached to what was done to them. The parliamentary commissions that eventually arrived and gathered evidence did so a generation after the worst of it, in mills that had been partially cleaned up for inspection, from witnesses who could be identified and therefore intimidated. What they found was still this. In June 1833, in Wigan, a factory commissioner sat across from a 10-year-old girl named Ellen Houghton. Ellen worked in William Eccles's spinning mill. She had been working there since she was 8. Her hours were 5:30 in the morning until 8 at night, 6 days a week, 9 hours on a Saturday. Her mother, Mary, took all her wages, every penny, because the piece rate on Mary's weaving had been cut almost in half in the years since the power looms arrived, and Ellen's shillings were the difference between the family eating and not eating. Ellen had run away from the mill at least 10 times. Each time she was brought back. The punishment for running away, among other things, was this. Mill weights were strapped to her back, an oversized cap placed on her head, and she was made to parade through the factory carrying a stick. While she walked, weighted down, humiliated, the other workers were permitted to poke her, punch her, and hit her. The purpose was to send a message to every other child watching. This is what happens when you leave. Ellen had still run away 10 times. The commissioner noted that Ellen spoke in such thick dialect he frequently had to ask her to repeat herself before he could understand her. He noted that she had never been inside a church or a chapel. She could not recite the bedtime prayer all children were expected to know. She had nothing to say about God or the future or what she wanted to become. She said she didn't like the work. Her mother, when asked whether she objected to Ellen being beaten by the overseers, said she had no complaint. She would rather they beat Ellen than fine her. The fines came out of wages. The beatings did not. The commissioner who interviewed them wrote in his report, "I hardly know what to say of the mother." He wrote it with confusion, as if Mary Houghton were a puzzle, as if the woman sitting across from him had made some incomprehensible moral failure, rather than being a woman who had been walked, step by step, through 4,000 Enclosure Acts and a decade of collapsing peace rates, and the settlement acts that kept her in Wigan, and the poor law that made the workhouse the only alternative to the wages William Eccles was paying, until the only choice she had left was whether Ellen was beaten or fined. Ellen Houghton does not appear in any records after her testimony. She married a man named Thomas Pye in 1841. She had a daughter named Alice in 1845. By 1850, she had either died or left her family. The census does not say which. She was 10 years old when she told the commissioner she didn't like the work. The mills were not the only place. Beneath England, literally in the seams of coal that ran under the north of the country, women and children worked in conditions that the Factory Commission, when it finally went underground to look, could barely describe without apology. In seams sometimes less than 2 feet high, in total darkness, in heat that made the air thick and difficult to breathe, women and children pulled carts of coal from the face to the shaft. They pulled them by straps attached around their waists and between their legs, on hands and knees through passages too low to stand in, through water that reached their calves, through air so hot that the lights periodically went out for want of oxygen. A girl named Patience Kershaw was 17 when she gave her testimony in 1842. She made 25 to 30 trips a day from the bottom of the shaft to the coal face and back, carrying 125 pounds on her back each time. When she had first gone down as a child, she said, she had frequently fallen asleep at the face while waiting for coal to load, because the heat and the darkness and the exhaustion combined into something her body simply could not stay awake through. She did not like the work, she said. She said it plainly, without drama, as a statement of fact about her life. I do not like the work, nor do the lassies, but they are made to like it. Isabel Wilson was 38 years old when she testified. She had been working underground for 30 years, since she was a child. She had been married for 19 years. She had given birth 10 times. 7 of her children were still alive. She had miscarried 5 times from the weight and the stooping and the crawling through water. She had been ill after each one. Her last child was born on a Saturday morning. She had been working in the mine on Friday night. A piece of coal broke her cheekbone once, she mentioned at the end of her testimony. It had kept her idle for some weeks. She said all of this in the flat, factual tone of someone who has learned that the facts of their life do not warrant particular emphasis. This was her life. It had always been her life. The mine had been taking from her for 30 years, and she had given what it took because there was nothing else. Because the commons were gone, and the Settlement Act kept her where she was, and the Poor Law waited at the end of every alternative with its principle of making things worse than whatever the mine was offering. Betty Wardle testified before the same commission. She had worked in the pit since she was 6 years old. She had a child born underground. She carried it up the pit shaft in her skirt. When the commissioner questioned whether this was true, whether it was really possible, she said, "Aye, that I am. It was born the day after I was married. That makes me to know." Sarah Carpenter was a former factory worker. Her testimony was published in the Ashton Chronicle in June 1849. She gave it under her own name. She described a woman named Sarah Goodling who had worked in the same mill. One day, Sarah Goodling was ill, poorly in the language of the time, and she stopped her machine. The overlooker, a man named James Birch, knocked her to the floor. She got up as best she could. He knocked her down again. She was carried to the apprentice house. Her bedmate found her dead in her bed the next morning. She described a woman named Mary who knocked her food can on the floor by accident. The master, a man named Newton, kicked her. In a place, Sarah Carpenter said carefully, where he should not have. Mary wore away slowly after that until she died. She described Caroline Thompson, who was beaten until she went out of her mind. These were not exceptional events. In 1833, 40% of the accident cases admitted to Manchester Infirmary were factory injuries. The mills that produced extraordinary wealth for the men who owned them produced, in the same rooms, from the same bodies, a steady current of injury and illness and death that the men who owned the mills described, when pressed, as the unavoidable cost of progress. Progress. the same word the Enclosure Commissioners used, the same word the Gomastas employers used in Calcutta, the same word Parliament used every time it refused, for another year, to regulate what was happening in the factories its members owned. Friedrich Engels arrived in Manchester in 1842. He was 24 years old, the son of a German textile manufacturer, sent to England to learn the cotton trade. He spent 2 years walking through the city. Not the Manchester of the mill owners, the broad streets, the counting houses, the civic buildings going up in the flush of industrial wealth. The Manchester underneath that one. He walked through the districts where the workers lived, and he wrote down what he found. 18,000 people living in cellars, streets without drainage, waste running between the cobblestones, pooling in corners. A river, the Irk, black with the discharge of factories and dye works and slaughterhouses, its banks lined with tenements so close to the water that the ground floors flooded when the river rose. Inside the mills, the air was kept at 90 degrees and saturated with moisture. The cotton threads snapped if the air dried, so the humidity was maintained regardless of what it did to the people breathing inside it. After years in that air, cotton fiber accumulated in the lungs, not visibly, not with sudden pain, just a gradual tightening of the chest, a shortening of the breath, a tiredness that sleep did not fix, year by year, until the capacity for air was simply less than it had once been. There was no cure. The lungs had been changed permanently by the work, and the work had been doing it since the person was a child. In 1840, 57% of working-class children in Manchester died before their 5th birthday. A farm laborer in rural Rutland, doing hard outdoor work in all weathers, lived on average to 38. A factory worker in Liverpool died at 28. Engels wrote down what he saw without flinching. "Women made unfit for childbearing," he wrote. "Children deformed. Men enfeebled. Limbs crushed. Whole generations wrecked, afflicted with disease and infirmity, purely to fill the purses of the bourgeoisie." He finished the manuscript at 26. He had not yet become famous. He was just a young man who had walked through the city and written down what his eyes found. Now hold those numbers beside this one. Richard Arkwright died in 1792, worth £500,000. The wealthiest untitled man in Britain. His mills ran day and night on 2 12-hour shifts. His workers earned 26 shillings a week. The children he employed were orphans taken from workhouses in wagons, told they would eat roast beef and ride horses. £500,000, 26 shillings a week. 57% of children dead before their 5th birthday. These numbers exist in the same ledger. They were produced by the same system, in the same buildings, from the same hours of the same human bodies. What separated them was not the contribution. The labor was everything. The machines were nothing without it. What separated them was who owned the machines. Who owned the parliament that refused for 60 years to regulate what happened inside them? Who owned the commons that had been taken to ensure the people had nowhere else to go? Who sat in the parliament that designed the workhouse to be worse than the worst factory, so that no matter how bad Lytton Mill was, Botany Bay seemed preferable? And even Botany Bay was not available unless you could be convicted of something. The men who built the system said, when the bodies finally accumulated visibly enough that Parliament could no longer pretend not to see them, "The workers are better off than they were. Real wages have risen. The Factory Acts will come. Progress is not clean. It never has been." And they were right that wages eventually rose. Right that acts eventually came. In 1833, in 1844, in 1847, in 1878. Each one dragged from Parliament against the resistance of the men who owned the mills. each one arriving a generation too late for the children already deformed inside them. Robert Blincoe appeared on political posters beneath a slogan borrowed from the campaign against slavery. "Am I not a man and a brother?" He was a man. The men who built the system that made his legs crooked had also built the system that made their own children straight and well-fed and educated, and future members of the parliament that would eventually, reluctantly, produce the acts that prevented the worst of what had been done to him from being done to the next generation. It had always been unjust. What changed was the visibility of the injustice. And the visibility came too late for Robert Blincoe's legs, too late for Sarah Goodling, too late for the 5 children Isabel Wilson carried to term underground and miscarried from the strain, too late for the boys at Lytton Mill who committed crimes hoping for transportation to Botany Bay, too late for Ellen Houghton, who ran away 10 times and was weighted and paraded through the factory floor 10 times, and who died or disappeared from the records before she was 30, and whose daughter, Alice, born in 1845, we know nothing about at all. There is one more side of this ledger. The people on the English side of it, at least, had Robert Blincoe to write a memoir. They had parliamentary commissions that eventually arrived and wrote down names. They had factory acts, however late, however inadequate, however extracted against resistance. The people on the other side had none of that. They had Nauroji counting, and Nauroji was heard with courtesy and without consequence. In 1750, while the Enclosure Commissioners were still riding into English villages with their measuring chains and their awards, there was a city on the other side of the world that every merchant in Europe dreamed about. Dhaka, capital of Bengal. The city that made the cloth that clothed the courts of the Mughals, the salons of Paris, the drawing rooms of London. Not cloth in the ordinary sense. Something that had taken generations of accumulated knowledge to produce, that required a specific cotton grown nowhere else on earth, that was so extraordinary it had been given names by imperial poets rather than by traders. Baft Hawa, woven air. Shabnam, morning dew. Abirawan, running water. These were not marketing terms. They were attempts to describe something that barely seemed possible. A fabric so fine that a bolt of 300 feet, the length of a city block, could be drawn through the center of a finger ring. So transparent that Mughal courtiers once reprimanded a noblewoman for appearing unclothed in court, only to be told she was wearing 7 layers of it. So light that when wet with evening dew, it became invisible against the grass. European travelers wrote about it with the helplessness of people trying to describe music. The words never quite reached the thing itself. The cotton it was made from, putti karpas, grew only along the banks of the Meghna River south of Dhaka, nowhere else on earth. The threads it produced were so fine they could only be spun in the hours before sunrise, in the early morning damp, because the moment the air dried and warmed, the threads would snap under their own tension. A master weaver, a tanti, spent years, sometimes a decade, learning to work at this scale. His fingers learned it the way fingers learn a musical instrument. Through repetition so deep it became a kind of knowledge the body held rather than the mind. A single piece of the finest muslin could take 6 months to complete. In 1750, the weavers of Bengal supplied more than 50% of the textile trade of both the Dutch and the English East India Company. India as a whole produced approximately 25% of the entire world's industrial output, more than all of Europe combined. Bengal was not a developing economy. It was the most sophisticated textile civilization on earth. By 1824, Dhaka was described in a British traveler's account as a city of magnificent ruins. What happened between those 2 dates is the other side of the ledger that the Industrial Revolution never shows you. Here is what the East India Company actually did, stated simply, without the language of progress it used to describe itself. The company arrived in Bengal as a trading partner. It wanted cloth. The weavers of Bengal had cloth. The arrangement seemed, on the surface, like commerce. But the company was not a merchant. It was, by the middle of the 18th century, a state, with an army, with the power to levy taxes, with the authority to imprison and to punish. And it used that power to do something no ordinary merchant could do. It forced the weavers to sell to it exclusively. The mechanism was called the advance system, and it worked like this. Company agents called gomastas arrived in weaving villages across Bengal. They were not traders who came to negotiate. They came with contracts and with sepoys, soldiers, and the understanding that the contract would be signed. A weaver who accepted the company's advance was legally bound to deliver cloth to the company at the price the company set, a price that historians have calculated was consistently 20 to 40% below what the weaver could have received in the open market. A weaver who refused to sign was beaten. The Board of Trade records from 1793 describe what the gomastas did to those who resisted. They were whipped or beaten with rattans. The weavers of Santipur filed a petition in 1801. It survives. They described, in careful and desperate language, what was being done to them. The gomastas deducted a rupee from every 8 or 9 rupees of the advance before paying it. They charged brokerage on money that was being given to them. They paid in debased coin. They classified finished cloth into lower quality categories and charged the company for higher ones, pocketing the difference. The rights to the production of individual weavers, the right to compel a specific man to weave for you and no one else, were freely traded among the gomastas as if the weavers were property. The weavers were not property. They were the finest textile craftsmen alive, and they were being systematically robbed by an organization that had an army to enforce the robbery and a parliament in London to ratify it. But the advance system, brutal as it was only the first instrument. The second arrived from Manchester. By the early 19th century, Arkwright's factory system had spread across northern England, mills multiplying, steam replacing water, the machines producing cotton cloth at a speed and volume that no human hand could match, cheaper than anything Bengal's weavers could make, cheaper than anything anyone had ever made. And the company, which controlled the ports and the trade routes of Bengal, opened those routes to British-manufactured cloth. Now the Bengali weaver faced a choice that was not really a choice. He could sell his cloth, the cloth he had spent 6 months making, the cloth that required a cotton grown nowhere else on earth, the cloth that bore names like woven air and morning dew, into a market that was being simultaneously flooded with machine-made cloth from Manchester, sold at prices he could not compete with, under tariffs that made his own exports to Britain prohibitively expensive. The tariffs on Indian textiles entering Britain ran to 70 and 80%. British cloth entering India faced no equivalent barrier. This is the precise moment where the argument being built across this entire video locks into place. The English commoner had his commons taken by an Act of Parliament, passed by men who stood to benefit from the taking. The factory clock had his time taken by an employer who owned the only timepiece in the room. The Bengali weaver had his market taken by a company that controlled the trade routes, set the prices, commanded the soldiers, and reported to the same Parliament in Westminster. Same mechanism, different country, different resource. The result? Identical. A floor removed, a dependency manufactured, an entire population left with nothing to fall back on except the terms the company was willing to offer. By 1800, textile exports from Bengal to Britain had collapsed. By 1824, Dhaka was ruins. By 1900, India's share of global industrial output had fallen from 25% to 2%. The looms fell silent. Not because the world stopped wanting cloth, because the world was now buying cloth from Manchester. There was a man in London who saw all of this with a clarity that cost him everything he had. His name was Dadabhai Naoroji. He was born in Bombay in 1825, the son of a Zoroastrian priest. He became a mathematician, a professor, a merchant, and eventually the first Indian ever elected to the British Parliament, representing Finsbury Central as a Liberal MP in 1892, winning by a margin of 5 votes after his opponent suggested that his constituents could not be represented by a man so black. He had spent decades before that election doing something that no one in the British establishment wanted done. He was counting. In 1867, Naoroji presented a paper to the East India Association in London. He called it England's Debt to India. In it, he laid out, in precise arithmetic, what the company, and then the Crown, had been extracting from India every year. Not through war, not through obvious theft, through the ordinary mechanisms of colonial governance, salaries and pensions of British officials paid from Indian tax revenues and sent to England, interest on loans that India had been forced to take to fund its own administration, profits from British investments that flowed out of India and never returned. He called it the drain. Approximately £12 million per year leaving India and arriving in England. Every year. Not as plunder in the dramatic sense, no armies carrying off treasure. As accounting, as the normal operation of a system in which the revenues raised from Indian people were spent on British people, in Britain, and never came back. The British establishment received his paper with a polite contempt reserved for people who have made an unanswerable argument at an inconvenient time. They questioned his methodology. They questioned his figures. They suggested that India was receiving fair value for what it was paying, in railways, in roads, in the gift of British governance. Naoroji spent the next 3 decades refining his numbers. By 1901, when he published Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, his estimate of the total drain had grown to between 200 and 300 million pounds, taken from a country whose per capita income was 1/13 that of England, a country that was, by every measure, becoming poorer, while the nation governing it became richer. He brought his evidence to Parliament. He argued it on the floor of the House of Commons. He was heard with courtesy and without consequence. The drain continued. In 1801, the city of Dhaka had a population of 200,000 people. It had been the capital of the muslin trade for 2 centuries, the largest and most prosperous city in Bengal, a city of markets and mosques and weavers' neighborhoods, Tanti Bazaar, the weavers' market, where the Tantis had worked and lived and passed their knowledge from father to son and mother to daughter for generations. The streets around the old Orong, the company's own trading house at Sonargaon 15 miles away, were where the finest muslin had been bought and sold, where merchants from Constantinople and Canton and London had come to acquire cloth they could find nowhere else on earth. By 1840, the population of Dhaka had fallen to 51,000, not from plague, not from war, from the departure of everything that had made the city what it was. The weavers left, or starved, or returned to agriculture in the countryside, where their hands forgot over years what they had known. The merchants who had come from across the world to buy the cloth stopped coming, because the cloth was no longer being made, because the market for it had been legislated out of existence, because the tariffs made it unsellable in Britain, and the flood of cheap Manchester cotton made it unsellable in India, because the Gomastas had spent decades paying prices that made the craft non-viable. Because the Great Famine of 1769 had already killed millions of weavers before the full mechanism was in place. And the famine had been made worse by company policies that prioritized revenue extraction over food distribution. Whole neighborhoods of Dhaka were abandoned between 1801 and 1840. The bridges over the Dulai River fell into ruin for lack of repair. The magnificent buildings of the Mughal era, the mosques, the palaces, the trading houses, stood empty or crumbling in streets that had once been crowded with the sound of looms. An Anglican bishop named Reginald Heber visited in 1824 and described what he found. He called it a city of magnificent ruins. Magnificent ruins. The rubble of what had been the finest textile civilization on earth, produced not by an earthquake or an invasion, but by a tariff structure and a trading monopoly and a parliament 10,000 kilometers away that had decided, across a series of individually defensible decisions, that Bengal's manufacturing wealth would be more useful to Britain than to Bengal. The knowledge went with the weavers. The putti karpas cotton that could only be grown along the Meghna River went untended. The skill of spinning in the early morning damp, the specific technique, the specific timing, the specific touch that kept the thread from snapping, was passed on fewer and fewer times to fewer and fewer hands until the last person who knew it died, and then it was simply gone. When researchers in Bangladesh tried to revive Dhaka muslin in the 21st century, the highest thread count a modern weaver could achieve was 300. The old masters had worked at 1,200. The knowledge was not suppressed or hidden. It was simply used up, burned through in a generation of weavers who had no market for it, no apprentice to teach, no reason to keep alive a tradition for which the world the company had made had no use. And when it was gone in the way that things are gone when the last person who knew them has died. Magnificent ruins. That is what the other side of the ledger looks like, stated plainly, without the language of free trade and civilizational improvement that was used to describe the transaction while it was occurring. But while Dhaka was becoming ruins, the workers of England who built the revolution were discovering what the revolution had left them. In 1652, Gerard Winstanley wrote a letter to Oliver Cromwell. The king had been dead for 3 years. Charles I had been executed in January 1649, his head taken off in front of a crowd in Whitehall, and England had been remade, theoretically, into a commonwealth, a nation belonging to its people, rather than to a monarch who treated it as his private estate. Cromwell was the most powerful man in England. The men who had fought the Civil War were using the language of freedom, of a new order, of a country finally governed in the interest of those who worked it. Winstanley read these words and wrote back. He had spent the 3 years since St. George's Hill writing, pamphlet after pamphlet, each one more precise than the last, each one saying the same thing in a slightly different way to see if anyone would finally understand it. His final pamphlet, The Law of Freedom, was addressed to Cromwell directly. It was his last attempt to make a powerful man see what was coming. "Remove the king," he told Cromwell, "and you will have accomplished nothing if the king's laws remain. The laws of enclosure, of private property, of the buying and selling of land that had once been held in common, these were not the king's invention. They were older than any particular king. They were the accumulated legal architecture through which one class of men had maintained its control over the land and labor of another class of men for centuries. Remove the king's person and leave the king's structure in place," Winstanley wrote, "and you have only moved the oppressor's power from one set of hands into another." The parliamentary boss would be the same as the kingly boss. He wrote this in 1652. Between 1750 and 1860, more than 4,000 parliamentary enclosure bills passed Westminster. More than 6 million acres transferred upward. The parliamentary boss turned out to be considerably more efficient at enclosure than the kingly boss had ever been. Winstanley's pamphlet reached Cromwell in a heavily edited form. the most radical passages cut by the publishers who transmitted it. Cromwell reportedly read it and found some of the milder proposals sympathetic. He did not act. Winstanley wrote nothing more after the Law of Freedom. He returned to London. He became a corn merchant. He married a second time to a woman named Elizabeth Stanley. He lived quietly for 24 years. In 1676, Gerard Winstanley died. He was 66 years old. He died in the middle of a legal dispute over a small inheritance he was owed, money left to him in a will by someone who had died. Money he could not collect because the legal process that governed such matters had been constructed by and for people with more resources than he had to navigate it. He died inside the machinery he had spent his life warning about. Not dramatically, not as a martyr. As an old man, frustrated, entangled in paperwork, unable to collect a small sum that would not have mattered if the Commons had survived. He was buried in the Quaker burial ground at Hampstead. No monument was erected. No marker has survived. The hill where he had pushed his spade into the earth in April 1649 and declared the earth a common treasury for all, St. George's Hill in Surrey, is now one of the most expensive private estates in England. The land he bled for is sold in gated plots that cost more than Thomas the commoner earned in a lifetime. Golf courses run across the ground where the diggers planted their parsnips and their carrots and their beans. Security guards patrol the perimeter. You cannot walk on that ground without permission from the people who own it. In 1999, 350 years after Winstanley's occupation, a group of activists marched to St. George's Hill and called themselves the Diggers of 1999. They occupied the land for a few days, planted seeds, issued a manifesto. They were removed within the week, legally. Here is what Winstanley actually said, not paraphrased, not interpreted. His own words, written in 1649, before any of what this story has described had taken its full shape. The power of enclosing land and owning property was brought into the creation by your ancestors by the sword, which first did murder their fellow creatures, men, and after plunder or steal away their land, and left this land successively to you, their children. And therefore, though you did not kill or thieve, yet you hold that cursed thing in your hand by the power of the sword. Read that again, knowing what you now know. He was writing to the landowners of England in 1649, before the Enclosure Commissioners rode into a single village with their measuring chains, before the factory clock was bolted to a mill wall, before a single Gomasta marched into a weaving village in Bengal with soldiers behind him, before Robert Blincoe was loaded onto a wagon in London and told he would eat roast beef and ride horses, before Isabel Wilson carried her 5 dead children home from the coal mines in her body. He was writing about the mechanism, the specific mechanism, common resource, legal capture, power held in the hand not by murder directly, but by the inheritance of what murder had once established, and the legal structures that perpetuated it without needing to repeat the original violence. He saw the whole shape of it. He was dispersed, legally. Winstanley was right about the mechanism, right that removing a king and keeping a king's laws changes nothing for the people the laws were designed to exploit. Right that the power of enclosure, once established as the operating logic of a legal system, would not stop at the Commons, that it would move through whatever was holdable, whatever was ownable, whatever a powerful class could transfer to itself through the instruments of governance it controlled. Right that the language it would use, always, would be the language of improvement, progress, the greater good, the natural operation of free trade. He wrote all of this down, in plain language, in 1649. And then the Enclosure Commissioners came, and the factory clock was installed, and the Gomastas arrived in Bengal, and Robert Blincoe lost half a finger at the age of 7, and Isabel Wilson carried 5 children to term underground and miscarried them all from the strain, and Dhaka fell from 200,000 people to 51,000 in 40 years, and Arkwright died worth £500,000, and the Parliament that authorized every step of this eventually, reluctantly, 60 years after Cromford Mill was built, passed the Factory Acts. Every person in this story who stood in the path of the mechanism and said this is what is being done, and it is wrong. Winstanley, the Santapur weavers who filed their petition, Dadabhai Naoroji, who counted the drain and brought his numbers to Parliament, Robert Blincoe, who appeared on political posters asking to be recognized as a man. Every one of them was heard. Every one of them was acknowledged. Every one of them was thanked for bringing the matter to attention. And then the mechanism continued. Because the mechanism does not require cruelty. It does not require anyone to be consciously malicious. It only requires a structural arrangement in which the people who benefit from a transformation also control the legal and political infrastructure that governs how that transformation occurs. Given that arrangement, it runs by itself. It ran for 100 years across England and Bengal, and the mines of Yorkshire and the mills of Lancashire. By the time its shape was fully visible, the world it had made was already locked in place. The commons were enclosed. The knowledge was gone from the fingers. The crooked legs were crooked for life. Winstanley saw the shape before anyone else did. He dug anyway. On the 1st of April, 1649, with 30 or 40 laboring men and their wives and children, he pushed his spade into the earth of St. George's Hill and planted his parsnips and his carrots and his beans. He knew the hired men would come. They always came. He knew the legal process would disperse him. It had the legal process, and he had a spade. He knew that the mechanism he was describing would not be stopped by 30 people digging a hillside in Surrey. He dug because the alternative was to pretend the gate was not closing. The gate closed. It always closes when the people who build it also hold the key. The only question Winstanley's life leaves behind, the question this entire story has been building toward from the first Enclosure Commissioner to the last factory child, is not whether the gate will close. It is whether the people inside it will see it moving before it does. He saw it. He was early. He was alone. And everything he saw came true.